The House That Whispers, Chapter 1. The invitation Daniel Reeves had always been a skeptic. A man of logic and reason, he dismissed ghost stories as mere fabrications of the human mind. So when he received an invitation to spend the weekend at the infamous Holloway House, he laughed. It was a joke, surely. The Holloway House had stood abandoned for over a century, nestled deep in the dense woods of Black Hollow. No one in town dared step foot inside after sundown. They said it wasn't just haunted, it was alive. The invitation was handwritten, old parchment sealed with wax. No sender, just the words. Come alone, midnight, Holloway House. Everything you seek is here. Daniel, a journalist known for debunking urban legends, saw an opportunity. If he could spend a full weekend in the house and come out unscathed, he could write the definitive article, exposing the local superstitions for what they were, nonsense. So, armed with his flashlight, recording equipment, and a week's worth of supplies, he drove out to the edge of the forest, where the road ended and the trees swallowed the sky. The house waited beyond the mist, a skeletal silhouette against the moonlit night. Chapter 2. The arrival Holloway House was larger than he expected. 3 stories of weather-worn stone, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the abyss. The grand door creaked open the moment he touched it, as if welcoming him in. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like old blood. The entrance hall stretched into darkness, lit only by his flashlight beam. Dust-covered portraits lined the walls, their eyes seemingly tracking his movement. Daniel smirked. Typical haunted house theatrics. He set up his camera in the grand parlor, speaking into it as he narrated his first impressions. This is Daniel Reeves reporting from Holloway House, the so-called most haunted house in the state. I'll be here for the next 72 hours documenting everything. As he spoke, a whisper curled through the air, a voice, distant and faint. He turned sharply. Nothing, just the wind filtering through the broken windows. But the house had noticed him. Chapter 3. The unseen watcher's night fell quickly, draping the house in deeper shadows. The old grandfather clock in the hallway, despite being broken, chimed 12 times. Midnight. Daniel lay in his sleeping bag in what had once been the master bedroom. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing dark stains underneath. He checked his audio recorder. Static. But as he was about to turn it off, he heard it again. A whisper. Louder this time. Leave. Daniel sat up. The air had grown frigid, his breath misting before him. He swept his flashlight across the room. No one was there. He chuckled nervously, rubbing his arms. Just my imagination, he muttered. Then the closet door creaked open. Chapter 4. The house speaks. Something moved inside. The darkness within the closet was thicker than the rest of the room, like a void. Daniel's flashlight flickered. He took a step closer, the floor groaning beneath him. He reached out, gripping the door's edge. Before he could pull it fully open, the whisper returned. Urgent, angry. Get out! A blast of icy wind burst from the closet, sending him stumbling backward. The flashlight fell from his grip, rolling across the floor. The room plunged into darkness. A sound filled the space, low and guttural, like breathing, but not human. Daniel scrambled for his flashlight, his heart pounding. When he lifted it, the beam landed on the closet. It was empty, but the whispering had not stopped. Chapter 5. The shadows in the walls. Daniel wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at him to get out, but his pride held him in place. He was a journalist, not a coward. He needed evidence. He set up his cameras throughout the house, determined to capture whatever was happening. As the hours passed, the whispering grew louder. Shadows moved in the corners where no light reached. The house was alive with unseen watchers. Then the scratching began. It came from inside the walls, soft at first, like rats. Then it grew, long, dragging nails scraping against wood. A moan reverberated through the floorboards. Daniel swallowed hard. This wasn't the wind, something was here with him. Chapter 6. The basement door by. The second night, Daniel was running on adrenaline. The air inside the house had grown oppressive, thick with an unseen weight. He replayed his audio recordings. In each, beneath his own voice, something else whispered, words he couldn't understand. A new sound emerged, knocking, from deep below. The basement. Daniel had avoided it, but now it was calling to him. He descended the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The basement door stood at the far end of the hall, its surface warped and splintered. The knocking stopped the moment. He reached for the handle, silence, then a deafening scream erupted from the other side. Chapter 7. The final hour. Daniel's nerves were frayed. His hands shook as he held the camera, documenting everything. He spoke to keep himself grounded. This place it's changing. It knows. I'm here. The walls pulsed, breathing with an unseen force. The whispering was no longer whispers. It was voices, a chorus of them, pleading, laughing, crying. A shadow detached itself from the far wall. It had no face, only a gaping maw that stretched wider and wider. Daniel ran, heart hammering, through twisting corridors that no longer led where they should. The house was shifting, rearranging itself, keeping him inside. Then the front door appeared, wide open. Salvation. He sprinted, lungs burning. Just as he reached the threshold, something cold gripped his ankle and pulled. The new voice. 3 days later, Daniel's car was found abandoned at the forest's edge. The cameras he had set up recorded only static. The house remained silent, empty. But if you stand outside its doors at midnight, sometimes you'll hear it, the whisper of a man's voice trapped within its walls, begging to be let out. The never-ending highway. Chapter 1. The Shortcut. James Holloway had driven the same route home for years. He knew every turn, every rest stop, every crack in the asphalt. So when a late-night detour sign forced him onto an unfamiliar highway, he didn't think much of it at first. The sign read, Route 13, faster route home. James was exhausted, his eyelids heavy as he navigated the winding road. The trees on either side were unnaturally tall, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. The road stretched endlessly ahead, with no intersections, no street signs, no headlights from other cars. He checked the clock on his dashboard. 1:47 a.m. A few miles later, he checked again. 47 a.m. His pulse quickened. The radio buzzed with static, and the GPS froze. The road stretched on, an eternal tunnel of darkness. He wasn't getting any closer to home. Chapter 2. The Stranger on the Road. After another hour, at least it felt like an hour, James saw something ahead. A figure, barely illuminated by his headlights. A hitchhiker. The man wore tattered clothes, his face obscured by a hood. As James slowed, the man lifted his head slightly. His skin was pale, too pale, like wax. His mouth moved, but no words came. Out, James hesitated, but his nerves got the better of him. He stepped on the gas and sped past the figure. Then, a mile down the road, the hitchhiker appeared again, standing in the exact same spot. James's breath caught in his throat. He locked his doors and pressed harder on the gas. The road twisted and turned, but no matter how far he drove, the same man stood ahead, always waiting. Chapter 3. The Town That Wasn't There. James kept driving until the road suddenly opened up into a small town. Old-fashioned street lamps flickered, casting long shadows over abandoned buildings. The gas station looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Desperate, James pulled over. He stepped out and tried the station's door. Locked. He peered inside. The shelves were stocked, but everything was covered in dust. A flickering neon sign above the counter read, "Open 24 hours." A rustling sound made him turn. The hitchhiker was standing across the street, watching. James backed away slowly, fumbling for his car door. The hitchhiker took a step forward, and then another. His lips moved again, silent words forming in the Cold air. James jumped into his car, slammed the door and turned the key. The engine roared to life, but the town had changed. The buildings were gone. The gas station was gone. Only the road remained, stretching endlessly into the void. Chapter. To the voices in the static. James kept driving. The radio crackled back to life, filled with whispers. Dozens of voices overlapping, speaking in languages he didn't recognize. Then, through the noise, a single voice broke through. "Turn around." James gripped the wheel tighter. He wasn't about to listen to a radio hallucination. He kept driving. "Turn around now." The headlights flickered. The dashboard clock was still stuck at 1:47 a.m. Then a scream ripped through the speakers, so loud it shook the car. James swerved, barely keeping control. The road had narrowed, the trees pressed closer. The air smelled wrong, thick and musty like rotting leaves, and then he saw it. A second car, parked on the side of the road, headlights off. James slowed, peering inside as he passed. The driver was slumped over the wheel, motionless. The car looked eerily familiar. Same make, same model, same license plate. It was his car. Chapter 5. The Mirror Road. James slammed the brakes and jumped out. He ran to the other vehicle, yanking open the driver's side door. The man inside was him, same jacket, same face. His own dead eyes stared back, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers that wrapped around him like invisible hands. James stumbled backward. The road beneath his feet cracked, splitting apart like broken glass. The world shimmered as though he were looking at it through a rippling pool of water. Then everything snapped. He was standing on the side of the road again, alone. The other car was gone. The hitchhiker was gone. The town was gone. His own car, idled nearby, door still open, engine humming softly. The radio crackled once more. "You never left." James didn't hesitate. He jumped into his car and floored the gas pedal, desperate to escape. Chapter 6. The Road with No End. James drove for hours, days. The road never changed. The clock never moved. Sometimes he saw headlights in his rearview mirror. Sometimes he heard voices whispering his name. But he never saw another soul. He stopped counting the days. Then, one night, he saw a figure ahead, a hitchhiker. James let out a breathless laugh, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had seen this before. He had lived this before. And as the man lifted his head, James realized the horrible truth. The hitchhiker was him, the endless loop. James is still out there, driving, searching. If you ever find yourself on a lonely stretch of highway in the dead of night, with no signs, no exits, no towns, check the clock. If it reads 1:47 a.m., turn around, or you may never find your way home again. I still remember the night I first encountered the whispering shadows. The memory is etched into my mind like a scar, a constant reminder of a time when reality itself seemed to shudder under the weight of unspeakable secrets. It began with a letter, handwritten on coarse, yellowed paper that exuded the scent of old ink and dust. I had received it by accident, tucked inside a forgotten book at the local library. The note read simply, "Come to Blackwood House. The truth awaits. Those brave enough to listen." I was skeptical at first, dismissing it as the work of a mischievous soul, but curiosity, that dangerous spark, soon compelled me to venture to the isolated mansion on the outskirts of our sleepy town. The drive to Blackwood House was an exercise in quiet dread. The winding road cut through dense woods, where the trees seemed to lean in and murmur secrets to one another. Every so often, the silence was broken by the creak of a branch or the distant howl of a creature unknown. As I neared the mansion, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette outlined against a bruised twilight sky. It was a sprawling, dilapidated structure with turrets that jutted out, like skeletal fingers, and windows that appeared as dark, unblinking eyes. I parked my car at the overgrown drive and hesitated, heart pounding in my chest as I approached the rusted iron gate. The gate protested with a shrill squeal as I pushed it open. Shadows writhed in the overgrown grass, and the wind carried whispers. that I couldn't quite decipher. With every step I took on the gravel path, my mind raced with both dread and anticipation. The door to the mansion was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in or warning me away. I pushed it open slowly, the heavy wood groaning in protest, and stepped into a grand foyer that had once been opulent, but was now shrouded in decay. The air was thick with the stench of mildew, and something more sinister, a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. Inside, the silence was absolute except for the soft echo of my footsteps. I moved through the dark corridors, my flashlight beam trembling as it danced over faded wallpaper and cracked portraits whose eyes seemed to follow me. The further I ventured into the mansion, the more the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and an indescribable presence seemed to press in on me from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by unseen eyes, that the walls themselves held secrets too dreadful to name. In one of the long-forgotten parlors, I discovered a faded journal lying on a dusty table. Its pages were filled with erratic, nearly illegible scribbles describing things that defied explanation, ravenous entities that lurked beneath the floorboards, voices that spoke in a language of sorrow and despair, and an insatiable hunger that drove the inhabitants of Blackwood House to madness. As I read, a low murmur began to rise in the distance, a sound that was almost like a sigh. I looked up, but the room was empty. The journal's final entry ended abruptly with a single haunting word: they. I decided then that I must uncover the truth of Blackwood House regardless of the cost. Over the following hours I explored room after room, each more dilapidated and mysterious than the last. In the library, I found rows of ancient books whose spines seemed to whisper out warnings in the silence. In the dining hall, a long-forgotten feast lay in disarray, as if the guests had left in a sudden panic. In the basement, I discovered strange symbols etched into the stone walls, symbols that pulsed with an otherworldly light when the beam of my flashlight passed over them. There, in that oppressive darkness, I felt the weight of countless eyes watching me from the void. As midnight approached, I returned to the foyer determined to make sense of the fragments of horror I had witnessed. That's when I first heard it clearly, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls. At first I assumed it was the wind, but the tapping was too deliberate, too methodical. It began as a faint murmur and grew into a steady, insistent beat. My heart pounded louder than ever as I followed the sound down a narrow corridor that led to a dead end. The corridor's walls were covered in peeling paint and intricate carvings of anguished faces. The tapping seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves, as if the house was trying to communicate a message through its own body. I pressed my ear against the cold surface of the wall, and for a brief moment I felt as though I could discern words, fragments of a language long lost, punctuated by a deep, resonant sorrow. The sound was hypnotic, drawing me deeper into the labyrinth of the mansion. Each step I took made the tapping louder, more insistent. My flashlight flickered and then died, plunging me into near-total darkness. In that moment, the oppressive silence was broken by an overwhelming cacophony of whispers, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once, each filled with grief and malice. I fumbled for my spare batteries and managed to revive the light, but the whispers persisted, echoing in the recesses of my mind long after I had left that corridor. The remainder of the night was a blur of terror and confusion. I encountered fleeting glimpses of figures in the periphery of my vision, pale, gaunt shapes that melted into the shadows as soon as I turned to look. At one point, I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and when I whipped around, there was nothing there but the flickering light of my dying flashlight. I tried to rationalize each incident, attributing them to my imagination, the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion or the effects of exhaustion. But as the hours wore on, it became impossible to ignore the truth. Blackwood House was alive with a malignant presence, and it had been waiting for me. In the early light of dawn, as I staggered up a creaking staircase, I caught a glimpse of something that froze my blood. In a mirror hanging on the wall of a narrow corridor, behind my own reflection, stood a gaunt figure. Its eyes were hollow voids, and its mouth was twisted in an expression of eternal agony. I screamed, stumbling backwards until I fell to the ground. When I looked up, the mirror was empty once more, but the terror it instilled would not fade. I spent the rest of that day in a haze of anxiety, unable to shake the feeling that the house was drawing me in, that it wanted something from me that I could not comprehend. I resolved to leave Blackwood House to escape its suffocating grasp. I gathered my meager belongings and retraced my steps, intent on finding the front door. But the mansion seemed to have other plans. The corridors shifted, twisting in ways that defied logic. Doors I had passed mere minutes ago were no longer there, replaced by walls that pulsed with a faint rhythmic glow. I wandered through endless hallways, the tapping sound of the walls now a constant companion. At times I would catch brief glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision. A flicker of a figure, a flash of light, the rustle of fabric in the darkness. The mansion had become a maze of disorientation and dread, a place where time and space lost all meaning. As evening fell once again, I found myself in a vast cavernous room that appeared to be a grand hall. The floor was covered with a thick layer of dust, and the ceiling was lost in shadows. At the far end of the room, a large mirror hung on the wall, its surface clouded and ancient. I approached it slowly, my reflection barely discernible in the dim light. But as I drew nearer, the image shifted. I no longer saw my own face. Instead, I saw the visage of a woman with sorrowful eyes and a look of deep, unfathomable loss. Her lips moved, though no sound emerged, and I felt as if her silent plea was reaching out to me, begging for release from an eternal torment. I reached out a trembling hand, and in that moment, the mirror shattered, scattering fragments of glass, like droplets of blood across the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence that followed. I recoiled in horror, realizing that with that act I had unleashed something far worse than I could have imagined. The air grew thick with an acrid smell, and a deep rumble resonated through the floor. The mansion trembled, as if it were awakening from a long slumber. From the shattered mirror, a figure emerged, a tall, imposing silhouette that moved with an unnatural grace. Its face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel its eyes upon me, piercing and unyielding. Panic seized me, and I turned to flee. I ran through the hallways, the sound of my footsteps mingling with the echoes of 1,000 whispered voices. The corridors twisted around me like a living labyrinth, and no matter how fast I ran, I could not escape the feeling of being pursued. The figure from the mirror seemed to glide effortlessly behind me, always just out of sight. At times I heard its raspy breath on the back of my neck. At other times, I caught a glimpse of its glowing eyes in the darkness. The mansion itself seemed to conspire against me. The walls closed in, the floors buckled, and doors slammed shut as if to trap me within its cursed confines. Desperation and terror merged as I stumbled into a large circular chamber whose walls were lined with faded murals depicting scenes of unspeakable horror. The murals showed figures writhing in torment, their faces contorted in agony. I could not tell if these images were the work of a mad artist or a record of the mansion's own dark history. In the center of the room, a stone pedestal bore a tarnished silver key, its design intricate and archaic. In that moment of desperate hope, I reached for the key, convinced that it might be my ticket out of this nightmare. But as my fingers closed around it, a low guttural growl reverberated through the chamber. The walls pulsed, and from behind the murals, shadowy tendrils emerged, reaching out as if to reclaim something that was rightfully theirs. I fled once, again, the key clutched tightly in my hand, running without direction through corridors that seemed to regenerate with every passing moment. The relentless pursuit of that unseen entity forced me into a frenzy, and I began to doubt the very fabric of reality. Was the mansion merely a building, or was it a sentient, malevolent force determined to claim every soul that dared trespass? In my mind, the two questions blurred into one, leaving me with the unshakable certainty that I was not alone in Blackwood House. I could feel eyes upon me, a constant suffocating presence that whispered of despair and doom. Time lost meaning. As I wandered the endless maze, my thoughts became jumbled, my memories fragmented like shards of broken glass. I recalled my life before the mansion, friends, family, the comforting routines of everyday existence. But those recollections seemed like echoes from another world, one that was rapidly slipping away. The mansion fed on my fear, its very walls, vibrating with a hunger that I could not sate. Each step I took was accompanied by the soft, mournful wail of the wind, as if the house itself were lamenting a fate long sealed. I began to see apparitions of past residents, spectral figures dressed in tattered clothes, their eyes void of hope, gliding silently through the corridors. They offered no words of solace, only silent, accusing stares that made my skin crawl. Found myself drawn to a small forgotten room near the heart of the mansion, a place that seemed untouched by time. In the center of the room was a simple wooden chair, its surface worn smooth by years of use. The room exuded a strange, hypnotic energy, and I felt compelled to sit. As soon as I did, I was overwhelmed by a cascade of memories not my own, visions of agony, despair, and betrayal that played out like a macabre film behind my eyes. I witnessed the slow, methodical decay of a once happy family, their lives unraveling under the relentless weight of an unseen curse. I saw the final, desperate moments of a child whose laughter had turned to screams, the anguished cries echoing in an empty, indifferent night. These memories were not mine, yet they became as real as the beating of my own heart. When I finally tore myself away from the chair, I was left trembling, drenched in cold sweat, and haunted by the faces of those long lost to Blackwood House. Night wore on, and as darkness deepened, the mansion's true nature revealed itself. I heard a soft, melancholic lullaby echoing through the corridors, a song sung in a language so ancient and mournful that it chilled me to the core. I followed the sound, each note beckoning me deeper into the house's labyrinth. In a narrow passageway lit only by the pale glow of a single candle, I discovered a small alcove where a figure knelt in silent prayer. It was a woman, her face hidden beneath a tattered veil, her hands clasped tightly around a faded photograph. As I watched, she lifted her head slowly, and in her eyes I saw an ocean of sorrow and regret. She mouthed words that I could not understand, and then, as silently as she had appeared, she vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the echo of her despair. In the following hours, I was tormented by a series of inexplicable phenomena. Doors that had been locked swung open on their own, revealing rooms filled with a bitter, cold mist. The sound of distant weeping followed me wherever I went, and every mirror I passed seemed to reflect not only my own terror, but also the tortured visages of those who had once suffered within these walls. At one point, I encountered a figure, standing at the end of a long corridor, a man with eyes like burning coals, his expression twisted in eternal anguish. He reached out a hand as if to implore me to join him in his torment, but as soon as our eyes met, he dissolved into a cloud of dark, swirling mist. I could feel his sorrow, a heavy, crushing grief that threatened to overwhelm my very soul. As the night gave way to the first tentative light of dawn, I stumbled into what I believed to be the main hall. The oppressive weight of the mansion was at its peak, and I realized with a dawning horror that I had been ensnared in its malevolent embrace. I clutched the tarnished key I had found earlier, desperate for an escape that seemed ever more elusive. In a moment of clarity amid the chaos, I recalled fragments of the journal I had discovered earlier, cryptic hints that the key was not only a means of unlocking a door, but also a symbol of release, a final test to prove whether one's soul was strong enough to break free of the mansion's grasp. With trembling resolve, I approached a massive door at the far end of the hall, its surface covered in intricate carvings that depicted scenes of torment and redemption. I inserted the key into the ancient lock and turned it slowly, each rotation echoing like a heartbeat in the silent hall. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading downward into a darkness that seemed to swallow all light. I descended the stairs, my every step resonating with the sound of distant cries and the soft rustle of unseen wings. At the bottom, I found myself in a vast subterranean chamber, its walls adorned with murals that told the story of Blackwood House, a tale of love, loss, and unspeakable horror that spanned centuries. The murals depicted a cycle of despair, where every soul that entered the house was doomed to wander its corridors forever, their essence slowly absorbed into its malignant heart. In the center of the chamber stood a stone dais upon which rested an ornate mirror, framed in twisted metal and adorned with cryptic symbols. The mirror's surface was unnaturally smooth, reflecting not the chamber around it, but a different world altogether. A world of endless twilight, where spectral figures roamed freely and the very air pulsed with sorrow. I approached the mirror, unable to resist its pull. As I gazed into its depths, I felt the boundary between my reality and that other realm begin to blur. The images shifted and changed until I could no longer distinguish my own reflection from those of countless lost souls. In that moment, I realized that Blackwood House was not merely a building, but a portal, a threshold between worlds, a vessel that contained the accumulated agony of generations. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of mournful voices pleading for deliverance, and I understood that I too was becoming a part of this endless cycle. The mirror's power was overwhelming, and as I reached out a shaking hand, I felt a force pull at me, a gentle, inexorable tug that threatened to draw me into its spectral embrace. I struggled against it, but the pull only intensified, and soon I was caught in a swirling vortex of images and sensations. I saw flashes of my own life, moments of joy and sorrow intermingled with the suffering of those who had come before me. Faces appeared in the mirror, their eyes filled with a silent plea, their mouths open in a soundless scream. I could hear them too, 1,000 voices rising in a cacophony of despair, each one begging for escape, for redemption, for a release that would never come. In that final harrowing moment, I felt the mansion's malevolent will claiming me, absorbing every ounce of hope and light from within me, until all that remained was a cold, hollow emptiness. I do not know how much time passed before I awoke. One moment I was lost in the abyss, and the next I found myself lying on the cold stone floor of the subterranean chamber, the mirror shattered into countless fragments scattered around me. My body ached, and my mind was a jumbled mess of terror and sorrow. With a great effort, I rose to my feet and staggered upward, driven by a desperate need to escape. The mansion had changed once again, the corridors now twisted in unfamiliar patterns, and the oppressive presence that had haunted me for so long seemed to have receded into the shadows. I moved with frantic haste, clutching the remnants of the key as if it were a talisman against the darkness. I emerged into the pale light of dawn, gasping for air as I stumbled out onto an overgrown path. Behind me, the mansion loomed silently, its dark windows reflecting a sorrow that would haunt me forever. I ran without looking back, the memories of that night seared into my soul. For weeks afterward, I experienced nightmares, visions of spectral figures and endless corridors, of whispered voices that would not let me rest. I could still hear the mansion calling to me, its malignant pulse echoing in the quiet moments before sleep. I tried to warn others of what I had experienced, but my words were dismissed as the ravings of a broken mind. Blackwood House became a distant, painful memory, a secret too terrible to share, yet its influence lingered in every shadow, in every creak of the floorboard. Sometimes, on stormy nights, when the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, I would feel that familiar, bone-chilling presence creeping at the edge of my awareness. I knew then that the mansion was never truly behind me, that its dark legacy had followed me into the light. And even now, years later, I find myself drawn to the quiet corners of the night, listening for that faint rhythmic tapping that signals the return of the horror I once knew so intimately. With trembling resolve, I approached a massive door at the far end of the hall, its surface covered in intricate carvings that depicted scenes of torment and redemption. I inserted the key into the ancient lock and turned it slowly, each rotation echoing like a heartbeat in the silent hall. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading downward into a darkness that seemed to swallow all light. I descended the stairs, my every step resonating with the sound of distant cries and the soft rustle of unseen wings. At the bottom, I found myself in a vast subterranean chamber, its walls adorned with murals that told the story of Blackwood House, a tale of love, loss, and unspeakable horror that spanned centuries. The murals depicted a cycle of despair, where every soul that entered the house was doomed to wander its corridors forever, their essence slowly absorbed into its malignant heart. In the center of the chamber stood a stone dais, upon which rested an ornate mirror, framed in twisted metal and adorned with cryptic symbols. The mirror's surface was unnaturally smooth, reflecting not the chamber around it, but a different world altogether. A world of endless twilight, where spectral figures roamed freely, and the very air pulsed with sorrow. I approached the mirror, unable to resist its pull. As I gazed into its depths, I felt the boundary between my reality and that other realm begin to blur. The images shifted and changed until I could no longer distinguish my own reflection from those of countless lost souls. In that moment, I realized that Blackwood House was not merely a building, but a portal, a threshold between worlds, a vessel that contained the accumulated agony of generations. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of mournful voices pleading for deliverance, and I understood that I too was becoming a part of this endless cycle. The mirror's power was overwhelming, and as I reached out a shaking hand, I felt a force pull at me, a gentle, inexorable tug that threatened to draw me into its spectral embrace. I struggled against it, but the pull only intensified, and soon I was caught in a swirling vortex of images and sensations. I saw flashes of my own life, moments of joy and sorrow intermingled with the suffering of those who had come before me. Faces appeared in the mirror, their eyes filled with a silent plea, their mouths open in a soundless scream. I could hear them too, 1,000 voices rising in a cacophony of despair, each one begging for escape, for redemption, for a release that would never come. In that final harrowing moment, I felt the mansion's malevolent will claiming me, absorbing every ounce of hope and light from within me, until all that remained was a cold, hollow emptiness. I do not know how much time passed before I awoke. One moment I was lost in the abyss, and the next I found myself lying on the cold stone floor of the subterranean chamber, the mirror shattered into countless fragments scattered around me. My body ached, and my mind was a jumbled mess of terror and sorrow. With a great effort, I rose to my feet and staggered upward, driven by a desperate need to escape. The mansion had changed once again, the corridors now twisted in unfamiliar patterns, and the oppressive presence that had haunted me for so long seemed to have receded into the shadows. I moved with frantic haste, clutching the remnants of the key as if it were a talisman against the darkness. I emerged into the pale light of dawn, gasping for air as I stumbled out onto an overgrown path. Behind me, the mansion loomed silently, its dark windows reflecting a sorrow that would haunt me forever. I ran without looking back, the memories of that night seared into my soul. For weeks afterward, I experienced nightmares, visions of spectral figures and endless corridors, of whispered voices that would not let me rest. I could still hear the mansion calling to me, its malignant pulse echoing in the quiet moments before sleep. I tried to warn others of what I had experienced, but my words were dismissed as the ravings of a broken mind. Blackwood House became a distant, painful memory, a secret too terrible to share, yet its influence lingered in every shadow, in every creak of the floorboard. Sometimes, on stormy nights, when the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, I would feel that familiar, bone-chilling presence creeping at the edge of my awareness. I knew then that the mansion was never truly behind me, that its dark legacy had followed me into the light. And even now, years later, I find myself drawn to the quiet corners of the night, listening for that faint rhythmic tapping that signals the return of the horror I once knew so intimately. The world may have moved on, and time may have healed many wounds, but there is a part of me that remains forever bound to Blackwood House, a part that will always listen to the whispers in the dark, always long for the truth hidden in the shadows, even if that truth comes at the cost of my soul. I share this tale not as a mere recounting of events, but as a warning, a reminder that some places are cursed with memories too terrible to forget, that some doors once opened can never be fully closed. And so if you ever receive a mysterious invitation, or find yourself drawn to a place where the air trembles with sorrow, and the darkness speaks in voices that should not be heard, remember that some secrets are best left undisturbed. For in the depths of such horror, the boundary between life and nightmare becomes perilously thin, and one may find themselves forever lost in the endless corridors of despair.